Okay, so the Switch has been an absolute sales beast. The system continues to sell very, very well and will most likely become the best-selling home console from Nintendo probably by the end of this year, and we keep seeing the games sell constantly. Even games that existed on the Wii U and are just simply being ported over with, at times, very minimal work done to it, certainly minimal additions, still sells really well. Doesn't seem to matter. First-party Nintendo games just continue to move off of store shelves with the Switch, which kind of brings us to the Switch's biggest test, at least so far. And that has to do with, can it sell a Metroid game? And this is something that's come up quite a bit recently, especially with Sean and myself in the Spawncast making a bit of a bet that this will end up being the best-selling game in the Metroid franchise so far. Guys, if you enjoy these videos, make sure that like button helps out a ton. And if you're new here to the Spawn Wave channel, make sure you subscribe down below and hit the little notification bell so you can keep up to date with all of the uploads going up here on the channel. And we're going to start today with this video sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by the Wonderful 101 Remastered. Last year, the Wonderful 101 Remastered was released, and now a new game mode called Time Attack has been added as part of free downloadable content. Time Attack is a purely action-focused challenge letting you test your skills by completing your stage of choice as fast as you can. Non-essential cutscenes are skipped automatically, and you can keep an eye on the new record gauge as you're playing to see how you stack up to your current best time. You can also compete against other players around the world and compare high scores online to see who can finish the fastest. More DLCs are still on the way for the Wonderful 101 Remastered, so make sure you stay tuned. Check out the link in the description box below to download the game and play the Wonder Size Cadet demo featuring Wonder Bayonetta right now. When you're ready to jump into the full game, make sure you take advantage of the big sale going on right now for the Nintendo Switch and Steam. Once again, thanks to the Wonderful 101 Remastered for sponsoring today's video. All right, if you're unaware, we made a bet on the Spawncast with Sean, RG85, that Metroid Dread would end up becoming the best-selling Metroid game in all of its franchise history, and that means it would have to sell 3 million units, and that's kind of where we landed. If Metroid Dread sells more than 3 million units, Sean will have to play Balan Wonderworld. So I thought, hey, you know what, let's make a video here and go over why I think, yeah, Metroid Dread could end up selling over 3 million copies, and then I'll finally find out how Balan Wonderworld ends from my favorite video game reviewer there, RGT85. So Metroid Dread was shown for the first time at E3 and got a pretty resounding bit of excitement from the Nintendo community, but especially longtime Metroid fans, as Dread does carry some weight with it in terms of history with the Metroid franchise. For over a decade now it's been talked about, and it's been 19 years since we've had a new Metroid game in the 2D series, with Fusion being on the Game Boy Advance. So obviously there's a lot of excitement. We found out from GameStop that it was the most pre-ordered game during that week of E3, so at least out of the gate, it seems to be moving along well enough. However, this game does have quite a bit working against it when it comes to the history of the Metroid franchise, especially recently. Actually, it's been on a bit of a slump when it comes to sales. I mean, if you take a look at the sales charts for all of the previous Metroid games, the best-selling 2D Metroid game was back in 1986. That's right, the first Metroid game on the NES at 2.73 million copies sold. The best-selling Metroid game ever is Metroid Prime on the GameCube, actually. And when that game came out, it looked incredible at the time, and it played really well, and it was such a different take on the Metroid franchise, which was 2D, right, is how we knew it then. So them going into like this first-person shooter adventure style game was so different that it actually brought a lot of controversy up online. And if I've learned anything from some of these Pokemon games, controversy sells units. So Metroid Prime is the best-selling Metroid game in the franchise at 2.84 million units. And after you go past that, it's kind of been rough waters for the Metroid series, even if you bring in something like the Wii, which is Nintendo's best-selling home console currently. I mean, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption didn't even make it to 1.5 million copies sold. Other M, 1.3 million copies sold. In fact, if you combine both of those on the Wii, once again, a system that was Nintendo's best-selling console, it still wasn't able to crack 3 million units. And if you go to more recent times in the last decade, you look at Metroid Prime Federation Force, 0.15 million units sold. And then Samus Returns, which is still kind of recent, at 0.56 million copies sold on, well, an install size of over 75 million units on the 3DS. Now, I do think Samus Returns came in at an unfortunate time for a 2D Metroid game. And one, it was a remake, right, of Metroid 2. But two, it wasn't even announced in that Direct. It was kind of an afterthought. It got ran over by Metroid Prime 4 being announced with a JPEG, which is still the one thing we have to hold on to for that game. I'm sure that'll be a fun conversation whenever that one gets revealed somewhere off in the future there. But it was already kind of out of the gate as feeling like Nintendo wasn't putting a big spotlight on it. They did end up releasing a system to go along with its launch, but by then, a lot of people were more or less asking, why isn't this game on the Switch? I really don't want to go back to my 3DS after I picked up my nice shiny new Nintendo system. But that's the last 2D Metroid we have to go on right now. Otherwise, we'd have to go back to, Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance, that just getting over 1 million copies sold. Basically, Metroid has never been accepted, I would say, by the mainstream audience. That audience is what really drives up the units sold on some of these big-time Nintendo first-party titles. Think of the Marios, of course, and most recently, the Zelda games. It's tough for Metroid to actually be able to get to that mark or kind of get to where it's more accepted as a big-time seller if the audience that just kind of walks into a Walmart or a Best Buy or a GameStop and just kind of browses and grabs it, whether it's a mom or a dad for their kids, isn't that interested in the Metroid franchise. And that's why it's such an interesting test for the Nintendo Switch when it comes to selling a Metroid game, because not a lot of Nintendo systems have been able to do that. I mean, when it comes down to 2D Metroid, the NES and the Famicom is like the only system that's been able to do that. At least the GameCube was able to sell Metroid Prime, but I think just the idea of the game and just such a transition for the entire franchise and the series actually sold that game. Of course, the game itself was very good, so that helped. But if you look at like the Switch's numbers right now, it sells games well. It has something called the Switch effect, and it seems to mostly work for first-party titles. Games you wouldn't think to sell well, sell well. I mean, think about all the pushback and controversy around New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe because they couldn't even take the U out of it. It was another Wii U port, and then here it is, over 10 million copies sold. Super Mario Party, that comes out, gets a lot of pushback because there's limited content at launch, doesn't have online play, doesn't matter, sells over 12 million copies. Again, games you wouldn't expect it. Don't even get me started on Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Once again, a game from the Wii U, transitioning over to the Switch, immediately becoming this massive seller, over 30 million units. And I mean, the list goes on. Even when we have things like Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee come out, and people are like, oh, it's this strange take on Pokemon, over 13 million copies sold. Splatoon 2, massive breakout for the series, even beyond what the first one was able to do as a new IP showing up on the Wii U, over 12 million copies sold. Super Mario Odyssey, over 20 million. Pokemon Sword and Shield, which had the whole thing with that N64 looking tree, over 21 million copies sold. But you know what is the most interesting one out of this whole thing? In fact, a game that has seen a pretty sizable gain out of the Switch effect is The Legend of Zelda. Like, no one really mentions this, but The Legend of Zelda, while it is a popular franchise, never really eclipsed 10 million copies that I remember anyway that's sold. You have to go back and you have to start adding up remasters and remakes under, the one title like Ocarina of Time, for example, to get above 10 million copies. But then here comes the Switch with Breath of the Wild that all the stars align for, by the way. The Switch, super popular. Everyone wants to grab one. And then here comes Breath of the Wild, which is touted as one of the greatest games of all time, all kind of coming out at the same time. And Breath of the Wild stuck around as like the Zelda game to get on that popular Switch system, so it's continued to sell well, racking up over 22 million units sold, which was a breakout for The Legend of Zelda. But that's Zelda. It's synonymous with Nintendo. I wanted to get a game that lines up a bit better with the Metroid series, even one that maybe has sold a bit less than Metroid, but is still at least there with Nintendo, and they'll still put games out for it, and that is Pikmin. Because we did have a Pikmin game released on the Switch. In fact, it was another Wii U port, and you can see the sales here for it. Believe it or not, Pikmin 3 Deluxe on the Switch. is the best-selling Pikmin game ever released. In fact, it is the first Pikmin game to cross over 2 million copies sold. Pikmin's never been a great selling franchise, and actually less than what Metroid's been able to sell, outside of some outliers, of course, from Metroid. It's still been kind of close. So Pikmin 3 Deluxe getting a bit of that Switch effect, over 2 million copies sold, does get me at least hopeful for what could happen here with Metroid Dread. But I think the funniest thing is that people are so interested in trying to play some of the older Metroid games that they're even dusting off and turning on their Wii U in order to do that, because we have some of the Game Boy Advanced Metroid games like Zero Mission and Fusion on the Wii U right now at $8 a piece. Great value, by the way. Fusion is an awesome game, and yeah, I guess it's worth turning on your Wii U to be able to play that, but I am shocked that Nintendo did not think to themselves, hey, you know what'd be a good idea? At least getting Fusion onto the Switch ahead of Metroid Dread coming out. There's still time. They could just randomly show up in September and say, oh yeah, Game Boy Advance games are now part of the Nintendo Switch Online, and oh look, there's Fusion. You can go ahead and get caught up there with that game ahead of Metroid Dread coming out. If they decide to launch Game Boy Advance on the Switch, I would hope that Fusion is one of the launch day titles for that service. But really looking at everything here, this is going to be, I think, Metroid's best chance to have a bit of a breakout, especially from its recent slump. I mean, it's obviously going to sell more than what we had with Samus Returns at about 500,000 units, but to be able to really break out for this series above that 3 million mark and show Nintendo that, yeah, fans actually want to buy these titles, I think is going to be very important for the series and the franchise overall, especially as we build up to Metroid Prime 4, something that people have been asking to see for so long now, since 2017 when we saw that JPEG. So maybe with kind of the name Metroid Dread being thrown around for the title here, and this pent-up demand for Metroid Prime 4, really even be able to just see it, could all culminate in a Metroid game finally breaking above that 3 million mark and showing Nintendo that it is a pretty valuable franchise. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below. I just kind of wanted to go over the other side as Sean continues to kind of talk about Metroid and downplay it a bit. I figured I would at least talk about why this could end up breaking out and becoming the best-selling Metroid game ever made. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.